Welcome back, everyone. It is time to begin our keynote address. We hope you enjoyed sessions 1 and 2 earlier today, and that you'll be joining us for the latter half of today's program. We are very excited to bring you a special guest speaker today, Stacey Vanek Smith. If you're like me, you feel like you know Stacey after enjoying her work for years, first on Marketplace, and then on NPR's Planet Money and The Indicator. But did you know that she's also a published author? After reading her book, Machiavelli for Women, one reviewer called it, quote, a must-read for every woman ready to wield power unapologetically, unquote. Whether she's hosting an episode of The Indicator or writing about how Renaissance politics apply to the 21st century workplace, or reporting on tipflation as NPR's global economics correspondent, Stacey has mastered an art that parallels what you do in the classroom, communicating complex concepts in accurate, engaging, and relevant ways. I know Stacey is eager to speak with you today, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Stacey now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Megan. That's a really nice introduction. I'm very thrilled to be here. I feel like we all do pretty much the same thing. And probably all love economics and face similar challenges with it sometimes. One of the challenges being presenting the information that is very important in a way that is interesting and compelling. So what I was going to do was kind of walk you through a story that I wrote that did exactly this. This was a couple of years ago. It was the moment when inflation was just starting to happen. There were all the arguments. I don't know if you guys remember the transitory inflation argument, but everyone was wondering, is inflation actually happening? There were all these signs it was, there were all these signs it weren't, that it wasn't happening. And so I wanted to kind of take a moment to actually look at what it was. I thought at that moment that seemed like the way that I could bring people in the most effectively. So I'm just going to go through that, and I'm going to play a little sound from the piece and things like that. And then I did also want to be able to answer questions too. So if you have questions, put them in the chat, and I won't speak for the whole time. I'll have some time left to answer questions. So if there are anything either about this or just in general, because I have spent a lot of time thinking about how to present economic concepts and ideas in ways that are interesting and creative and compelling. And I guarantee if you're running up against something, I've probably run up against it too. So here we go. I first of all should say that I really do love economic data, which is not something I ever thought I'd say when I was growing up. I was not interested in economics or math at all. I was very much sort of a liberal arts literature kid. But now I love data so much that I actually get butterflies in my stomach before the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases the inflation report every month. Also, the jobs report, I actually get butterflies. Of course, not everyone has that reaction. And when you're explaining economics or telling these stories or explaining these concepts, a lot of times you kind of have to sell it. You have to try to make it exciting, try to make it relevant to people, try to make it come alive. And one way that I like to try to do this is to educate people on what the data actually is. Like, where does this number come from? How is it calculated? I like this approach because I feel like it has kind of a lasting effect rather than talking about a piece of breaking news in the moment or inflation hitting this number right now or that number. If you help people understand what it is, often can make people feel smarter, and they will get excited about economics and data for like years to come, hopefully. I mean, maybe not like butterflies in their stomach excited, but excited. And so with that in mind, I wanted to take everyone back in time to 2021. It was a simpler time. Inflation was transitory. And at the time, there was this very hot debate over whether there was inflation happening in the US economy. It had gotten very political, as everything does seem to do these days. But essentially, everyone was looking across the economy and asking this question, well, this is more expensive, but this isn't more expensive. And what is inflation anyway? Do we have to worry about it? There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of mixed signals about the economy, which of course we've been seeing a lot of lately. And so I decided to do a story about inflation. And I wanted to make the data itself the main character instead of weighing in on this debate. And I wanted to play this for you because I've thought about this story so many times as we've been hearing about inflation over and over again, about this data over the last couple of years. In this piece, I learned how the consumer price index, the CPI, was formed, how they make that number, how the Bureau of Labor Statistics gets that data. And it has completely forever changed the way that I think about inflation. This was for The Indicator from Planet Money. It was a daily podcast about business, and it is a daily podcast about business and economics. And the audience is probably a lot like an econ class. I mean, it's a pretty general audience, but we don't assume they know anything about economics or that they're naturally interested in any topic that we're addressing. So you've got to try to make it interesting and compelling. So I wanted to start the story out explaining the basics. So I'm gonna play chunks of the story. So here's how the story started out. Here's how the story started out.
Inflation. It is a huge concern about the economy right now. Inflation is just a fancy name for prices going up. And if prices start going up at a really fast pace, it can signal the beginning of a so-called inflationary spiral. That means prices going up out of control. So like your latte goes from $4 to $10 to $50. That can cause enormous destruction to an economy and of course to the savings of millions and millions of people.
So that is incidentally, I think lattes have hit almost $10 at this point. But that is kind of this place setting of what this data is, of what inflation is. You have a summary about where the data comes from. And now it is time for the main character in our story. This is our data meeting, our data meet cute, meet the CPI.
It's one of the most important indicators for any economy. It's measured using something called the Consumer Price Index. The CPI, it's just a measure of the price of everything we buy.
How do you measure something like that? Like, how do you measure the price of everything we buy?
The process is meticulous, labor-intensive, and it involves hundreds of people. It's also top secret. This data is closely guarded because it needs to be above suspicion and tampering. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics agreed to let us tag along for half a day.
Yes, they did. All I had to do was sign like 8 non-disclosure agreements. But totally worth it.
We got into the belly of the beast, the inflation machine. This is The Indicator from Planet Money. I'm Darian Woods.
And I'm Stacey Vanek Smith. Today on the show, the inflation watchers. We go under the hood of the CPI and see how the government determines whether inflation is happening.
Okay, so I'm doing a couple of things here. I need to try to make this exciting, and full disclosure, I spent the day with a data collector on Zoom. So that does not sound very exciting. So I've leaned a lot into the exclusivity part, the non-disclosure agreements, this idea that the data is guarded, that it's secret, to kind of make it feel special. It's like the secret club. It's the skull and bones of pricing. Everybody gets this special look. That is the setup. It's kind of like the hook to get people to listen. So we're inviting you into the secret world most people never get to see. In reality, it was a 5-hour-long Zoom call. However, if I said that, I think people would just like switch their phone over to like email or TikTok so fast that I wouldn't even be able to finish the sentence. So instead, I start using some of the storytelling tricks that we talk about at Planet Money and deploy all the time. And that kind of helps bring this number to life. So I'm going to talk about 5 of the kind of tricks that I use to bring a story to life. And these are tricks that we use in lots of different ways, but there are 5 pretty main ones that you'll see a lot in when people kind of try to explain economics or tell the stories of economics. Trick number 1 is using people, because as humans, we connect through individuals, not numbers. So like a really simple example of this is jobs numbers, right? You know, there's the unemployment rate, there are the number of jobs created. You hear the number, you're like, great. Now, if you hear from someone who's lost their job, if you hear from someone who just got a job after months of looking, now that we're interested in, that perks us up. So people care about individuals. And if there's any way to connect the data to an individual, that's the way that you got to do it. So normally in inflation stories, you will hear journalists all the time talking to shoppers who are on a budget, distressed over a rising price or something like that. In this case, we're looking at the data, where the data comes from. So finding a shopper is like less relevant. So what we did was we found the humans who are getting the data.
To get the inflation number every month, millions of data points are involved, gathered by around 450 dedicated workers.
Hi, my name is Emily Masitis, and I am an economist with the United States Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics.
So there is our human. She is our data gatherer, our inflation watcher. She is our guide into this world of data. She is the hero of our story, because it can be hard to care about collecting numbers, but it is not hard to care about Emily.
Every month, Emily and her colleagues go on a hunt for inflation, living among us, hiding in corners, slipping onto store shelves.
Okay, so now little dramatizing of inflation, but that's our villain, but we have found our hero. Our hero is Emily, and it is time for trick number 2, which is the frame. The frame for this story. So we identify the quest for our hero. What are we setting out to do? If people stick around and listen, what can they expect? Where's this going? I really like, as a journalist, to frame stories as a quest or a hunt, especially when things are uncertain, because first of all, it just sounds a lot more exciting and dynamic than we made some calls, but it's also really useful, I find, because it's an engaging way to tell a story that doesn't involve pushing an angle or an agenda. You're just on a quest to find the truth. So you can be really intellectually open on a quest. You can look at one side, you can look at the other side. And it also, as I think, helps listeners relax a little out of, I think people can get very defensive if they feel like an agenda's coming. And so I think it relaxes their defense. If people are more open to learning and are like, hey, wait a minute, you know, what kind of agenda are you pushing? Are you trying to say there's no inflation? Or, you know, hey, wait a minute, are you trying to say there's inflation because it's transitory or whatever? But if you're just like, where does this data come from? Then people can kind of get curious and they want to explore, and you're in it with them. And so we're all on a data quest with Emily Masitis.
And of course, to do this, people like Emily track the price of like everything we buy, from haircuts and trucks to toasters and rent to venti lattes to Big Macs to weddings to yoga pants, all of it.
And my favorite saying is, we follow prices on pretty much everything that is legal in the country.
Okay, so that is our quest. Our price is rising. We're trying to find out, is inflation a thing? Emily's going to help us figure us out. We're on a quest with Emily to figure this out. We're solving this mystery together.
This is a huge job, and it starts with surveys taken by thousands of households, just everyday people all across the country who write down in really minute detail how they spend their money.
Yeah, so they'll write down something like, you know, I bought butter at the store. And then inflation watchers like Emily will find, you know, a particular brand of butter at a particular store, and they will track the price of it for years.
So now it is time for trick number 3 in storytelling. We have our human, we have our quest, and this is a big one. Details. Details are the key to unlocking to making data interesting. I think it's one of the main keys. So when I feel like that sounds counterintuitive, but the details I think really bring the story to life. You want to use details and specifics to help like paint a picture in somebody's head. That is when they become actively engaged in a story. Like a very easy example is, a man walks out of a store wearing a coat. Like that's not very compelling, but if a man walks out of a check cashing store with his head down, looking at the sidewalk, pulling this really thin blue coat around him on this freezing January day, those details start to paint the picture and tell a story. And as a listener, you can see this man in your head. Now you're invested. We're creating this story together. You're involved. And I think one of the reasons that people sometimes feel radio is such a good emotional medium is because of this, because it is a co-creation between the listener and the person talking. So what we want to do is give some details about how the data is collected, some little splashes of color that will kind of get people's imaginations going.
Everything has a code. Salted butter has one code. Unsalted butter has a different code. Butter and sticks, different code. Organic butter, that's also different. And this is true for every consumer product in the US.
We have a 600-page manual for a reason.
Really? It's 600 pages. Have you read it?
I have. There are
Really?
some
Every
to
page?
learn. I have, yeah.
Wow. So enthusiasm is, of course, the unbridled enthusiasm is also the other unspoken rule of reporting on economics. But okay, so this is also like this moment is a little bit of a description of the obstacle in this quest, right? This is what our hero Emily is up against. All of these millions of codes, these thousands of products, a 600-page manual. The task seems impossible, really daunting at least. And, so these little details actually help give a scope of the hugeness of this task. It seems impossible. How do you track the price of every single kind of product across this vast country? It makes her, like the smallness actually makes her job seem bigger. And so now we get to the nitty gritty, which is just how do you wrangle all this data? How do you wrangle all these facts, these disparate facts, all these different kinds of butter? How do you tackle this obstacle? And this gets into our story arc. That is storytelling trick number 4. And the arc really consists of like setting out on a quest, getting partway along the journey, hitting an obstacle, there's the harrowing climax, and then there's the conclusion. So that is just like the basic story arc we kind of follow. Of course, it's a little comical because this is just a person making phone calls to stores, but you gotta use what you got. So we start off on our quest.
To check these prices, inflation trackers like Emily used to drive around to stores, find a particular tub of unsalted butter or a 100% wool boat neck sweater in size 8, and look at the price tag for that particular item. And then come back to that store to look at that same item and the price of it month after month, which sounds really old school and really labor intensive. But this data is just that important. It has to be accurate. And they didn't want to rely on phone calls or online prices.
Of course, COVID changed everything. In-person was no longer an option. So now, instead of walking into stores and checking price tags, now Emily's day is a lot of this.
Let me put him on speakerphone. This is Emily Masitis calling with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. How you doing today? Good. We are just doing the Consumer Price Index update on our pair of socks.
Socks. Of course, Darian, I cannot reveal the brand of socks because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. It's confidential. But these are white athletic socks. Of course, they are not just any white athletic socks, though.
Just verifying some specifics on the item. It's knee length, is that correct?
Yeah.
And then I have that it is 85% acrylic and 15% nylon.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I have that it has moisture wicking, is that correct?
Yeah, repels moisture.
Okay, great.
So this is the beginning of our journey. And now we are doing the thing. We are getting the data. We are off. The journey has started. we're out in the world with Emily, and we are on the case for socks, and we are solving this mystery. The socks are part of it, which is, are we experiencing inflation? Is inflation happening in the US?
Emily makes a note of all of this. She gets to the right code. And now the moment is here. The price.
So they're $7.99.
$7.99 for the socks. Turns out the price hasn't changed since last month.
So the sock indicator, Darian, telling us inflation isn't happening.
That's good.
But
Now, just to step back for a second and kind of illustrate the importance of storytelling in these situations. Imagine you heard this phone call without any explanation. It would seem so boring and so irrelevant. So I'm just actually going to play that bit of audio again. And just imagine you had no context. There's no journey, no details, no charming Emily. There's just, this, like inflation calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and, workers like Emily Masitis call merchants around the country and ask them to price particular items. So just pretend that you were just hearing this cold.
This is Emily Masitis calling with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. How you doing today?
Good.
We are just doing the consumer price index update on our pair of socks.
Yeah.
Just verifying some specifics on the item. It's knee length, is that correct?
Yeah.
And then I have that it is 85% acrylic and 15% nylon.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I have that it has moisture wicking, is that correct?
Yeah. Repels moisture.
Okay, great.
So they're $7.99.
So that was, I 5 hours of that tape is what I had. So that is why, like, our quest, the framing, the human hero, the details are so helpful, because I think it just makes all the difference in engaging people in this story and in this news and in this concept of inflation. So back to our quest.
But that is just one product in one store. And you cannot measure inflation using just one pair of socks. Emily has at least 30 more price checks ahead of her today.
So we've done socks. The next step on the journey, we go from goods to services. I really wanted to pick products or, the details that would illustrate larger themes instead of just random details. So in this case, socks are a good, and now we're pricing something, and we did other goods too. We priced beer and a bunch of other things. But I wanted to price something that was a service.
And it's not just products like socks. The Consumer Price Index tracks services too. Haircuts, car repair, workout classes.
Daycare. In this case, the weekly rate for a 2-year-old at a daycare in Philadelphia.
For this one, Emily checks the price on the daycare's website.
So I have older toddler here, and the weekly full-time tuition is $320. That changed. So the price for this one it was in April, it was $306.
That's a lot.
It's pretty significant.
Over a year, that's
So
a dollar.
inflation in action.
Inflation in action. The price per week of daycare is up 5% from the month before. And Emily says it is the second month in a row that this price has gone up.
So there it is. We've seen some evidence of the dreaded inflation.
So we have 2 pieces of evidence here. We are mid-journey. And so far, one of our clues points to no inflation, one points to yes inflation. And now we're getting to the riveting climax of our story, but we need a little setup. And one thing that I often find helpful in helping connect to the audience and helping the audience connect to the news or the story is talking about my own internal journey. It can keep people engaged when you're talking about something really dense like data. And, when I'm recording and what I'm getting is not super dramatic, it's pretty straightforward. I kind of create a dramatic frame myself. So in this case, I can be like a foil for the listener, like jumping to a conclusion before I should, or talking about what comes to mind, oh my gosh, inflation, oh my gosh, no inflation. And it just like helps to infuse the story with some emotion. And also it can help you address what's maybe coming into the minds of a lot of people without taking one side or the other.
I was like, here it is, inflation in the flesh. And
Yes.
Emily was like, okay, let's look at a few more prices. Let's make some more calls. So she let me tag along to a couple more phone calls, including to a little corner store in Philadelphia to check the price.
Yeah.
of butter.
Look, where I come from, New Zealand, big butter producing nation, butter is very exciting.
It's butter. It's not that exciting.
What? Sure.
We will be the
I-
judge of that.
Oh, yeah.
Darren's like part of my job to get excited about esoteric things. And I think I kind of freaked Emily out with my enthusiasm.
So this is one way to kind of dramatize the data in a way that is intellectually honest, but also it does a job of kind of contrasting Emily's like steadfast groundedness. My dramatics, which is sort of a foil for maybe like the public discourse and all the drama in the media and on social media and everything. And then there's Emily's groundedness, the diligence of the data collector. It showcases the science and precision of this data collection, right? You are neutral as a data collector. You don't have a bunch of like unhinged people going bananas over the price of socks like I was being. You have Emily, who is diligent, she's unflappable, she's just getting the facts. And that, in fact, is part of what makes this data so reliable. It has the effect of making the data look even more impressive than it was before, because, you know, this is just this reliable, stoic data. So now it's the moment, the big climactic moment of the piece, which is the price of butter.
How you doing?
Okay.
I am just calling to do our monthly check on butter for the Consumer Price Index.
Specifically, a box of 4 sticks, unsalted.
Yes, the price is $4.35.
435.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so that's gone up 25%. It looks like the last time it was 349. Do you happen to know why it's increased so much?
So this is a big moment. I mean, you can imagine I was on this 5-hour Zoom call, and this was the moment when like I was like angels were singing, not because I wanted there to be inflation, but because I was like, oh my gosh, something is happening. The price of butter is up 25% month over month. That is a huge price jump. And this feels in this moment like this incontrovertible evidence that inflation is walking among us. So first daycare and now butter. But this is where Emily, our hero, does such a great job. She is very calm in contrast to my sort of emotional storm. She hears this number, and this is how she and how the Bureau of Labor Statistics deals with news that is sort of like dramatic and shocking about this massive price increase that would seem to say, yes, inflation is happening, and it is really happening.
Emily gets very focused here because this is potentially a really big moment in the inflation hunt. Price rising by that much actually requires filling out a special form for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I mean, it could be evidence of spiraling inflation.
But Emily's been doing this for years and her spidey sense is going off. So before she fills out that special form, she asks the store owner to double check the price of that butter.
Okay, so here's the grand climax. Has the price of butter really gone up by 25%? What is that? We have to build a little tension until
the store owner puts the phone down. We wait for a minute, comes back on.
Okay, so it's not 435 right now?
No, it's $2.
So it turns out he was looking at the wrong brand of butter. And in fact, the particular butter Emily's been tracking is part of a promotion this week, 2 for $5. So one package costs $2.50, which is actually less than it cost last month.
Okay, that's what I was like, that's a huge increase for butter, huh? You have to stock up on it. I'm glad you took the time to look that up for me. That I appreciate it.
So here's where I think the conclusion, the theme of the story, for me at least, kind of emerges, which is the diligence of the people making sure to get it right. How much we count on that second ask, how important this data is, how responsibly it's collected, how this data is different from my own sort of visceral observations in the supermarket or, you know, talk on social media. It shows us the value of data, at least it did for me, and the value of properly gathering data. And so our journey ends.
So the results of this inflation quest, could we find any lurking around on supermarket shelves? Socks, same price, no inflation. Daycare, more expensive? That could be a sign of inflation. Butter, well, it's part of a temporary promotion. It's not the regular price.
Yeah, Emily says we can't really call the butter this month. We will have to wait.
Of course, the story is not quite over because I think when you're looking at something complicated like data, it is important to give people something to take away. The moral of the story, if you will, and that is my final trick, part 5, the takeaway, to help the audience make sense of everything they've heard, of this journey that we've all been on. And I think this is really important and it really often gets glossed over. But, you know, people have stuck with you this whole time and they want a payoff. They want a takeaway. And so this time, like, you want this co-created story to feel meaningful, to feel valuable, and to help them maybe understand the world around them better, a bit better going forward. Not just here's this story, but here's how you can use the story to look at the world a little bit differently.
And this is why it is so important to be so precise. All of these details matter. I mean, this number, this giant CPI inflation number that we see every month that moves markets and helps drive government policy, it comes down to this. A woman calling a supermarket in Philadelphia to check the price of butter and then double checking to make sure that data is right.
I will give you a call next month.
Okay.
Have a great day.
So our quest is complete. Our 5-part storytelling is achieved. One thing you can think about is adding a little twist sometimes. For example, last year, the price of butter rose 24%. So it turns out the grocery store owner's mistake was a little bit prophetic, or even a modest estimate, because this year so far it's up another 8%. So that is the story of the CPI data, and how I tried to make inflation more understandable and interesting for people. And I would love to take some questions in our remaining time if there are any. Let's see. Oh, look, it looks like there are some great questions. Okay, I'm gonna start with Felicia. I guess I'll just read the question out and answer it as best I can. I had students roughly 18 years ago create their own CPI basket. Oh, I love that. The intent was to update each semester or year. I eventually gave up updating because inflation rate was so steady. So use it to distinguish between inflation and the inflation rate. This year, I resurrected it using students' details from way back when. Some products couldn't be used, not made anymore. That is such a great thing. I love the idea of having people make their own inflation basket, because I mean, that is kind of how we all experience inflation anyway, with separate products and our own things we buy. And so I think that's really great. And then you can also look at like the inflation baskets that other places use, because a lot of places use different things in their inflation baskets, and you can kind of like compare. And, you know, also look at what the outliers are. I don't know. I think that's such a great idea. Has anyone had students create their own CPI basket? Oh, yes. In fact, yes.
And Stacey, David had a question earlier. You have to scroll up a little in the chat, but he was asking about how you bring in real world data without going too far into the weeds while still helping the audience maybe focus on the basic principle. So anything you can speak to around that would be helpful.
Yes, I mean, there's always a balance, right? Because the whole point of talking about the data is to like dive in, like, let's take this on. But at a certain point, it's only interesting to people who really know the data. So I think, I mean, one really good example is the jobs report. It comes out every month. It's probably the data that is most known. I think the economic data that is most known. And some of it everybody knows. It's going to be interesting to everybody. You know, like the unemployment rate dropped to 3.6%. Everyone's like, oh, okay, the unemployment rate dropped. That sounds good. Or like 290,000 jobs were added. Even still, you need to put that in context, because 290,000 jobs right now was like under expectations. I think that's what it was. But, you know, in like whatever, 5 years ago, 290,000 jobs would have been a great month. So there always has to be that context. But I think it is always good to give people the tools to look at the data themselves. So I think just mentioning the actual data, but then giving context right away.
Yeah,
Because
I guess my point was that, like, with high school age students, like the Phillips curve, for example, they're like, oh yeah, this totally makes sense. And it matches up with the ADS model. And then the next class period, they come back and they're like, is it even a thing? Like, so they get their confidence shook because the data sets don't always work, but you want to bring them in to kind of tie it to real world stuff. But how do you balance that with, at the end of the day, they have to be able to apply the basic kind of Econ 101 models?
Well, the Phillips curve is interesting because I heard Ben Bernanke give a talk years before the pandemic on how, like, is the Phillips curve dead? So Ben Bernanke was asking the same questions your students were, which kind of shows that, like, economics is a living thing, right? People develop theories and associations, and then those things change. And I think there's something really great about that. But in fact, your students hit on, like, exactly the same thing Ben Bernanke was proposing, which was, I think he was sort of concluding the Phillips curve no longer applies. And then inflation kind of rose again. And so now the Phillips curve is back in question. So I think using those moments, I don't know, I find the mystery frame very helpful, because it seems like what you're hitting up against, which is something I hit up against too, is when the data doesn't make sense. It's telling an inconsistent story. And it's like, well, wait a minute. How is, are we in a recession because unemployment's going down? Like, what is the story? And so I find the mystery frame often, or quest or mystery journey, really helpful, because then, like, whatever happens, it's just part of the mystery, instead of it being like, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't work. It's like, wow, so why isn't this working? Like, what's going on? That's something that is possibly helpful.
Matt asked about your favorite, if you have a favorite episode of the podcasts you've worked on, or a favorite topic that you like to cover.
Oh, I mean, I love commodities. I love commodities because part of it is I grew up in Idaho. My family was in farming. So I think I always connected to that. But also the thing I like about commodities is you can touch them. And so there's, like, the whole process of it sort of travels the whole economy. I mean, there's the getting the thing out of the ground. Whatever, let's say it's silver or something, there's getting silver out of the ground, and then there's the market for silver, and then why the market for silver is changing. But there's this whole very human process. So we did a series about oil where at Planet Money, where we purchased 100 barrels of oil, and we followed it all through the refining process. We purchased it from this oilman who had a little
Okay.
stripper wells, but they're just very wells at the end of their life. So people buy them up for cheap and they don't produce much oil. So we bought 100 barrels from him, and we just followed it into the tank of a car. And that was, I think, one of my favorite. That stands out as one of my favorite stories.
I think we have time for one more. There was a question about, have you ever had an episode or story you're reporting go in a totally different direction than you expected, but something veered off?
Oh, all the time. I mean, I feel like that's been happening ever since the pandemic. Like, the data doesn't always make sense, or I mean, this happens all the time, because you have this story idea and you're all excited and you start reporting it, and all of a sudden it seems like everything is pointing in a different direction. You're like, oh, this is amazing. I wonder if people are racking up all kinds of credit card debt. It's like, no, they're not. This isn't a story. But I actually try to do, I think the reason I like the mystery frame so much is I try to do it in my own head. I can naturally get very sort of discouraged about stuff, or get very cynical, or like, oh, this is a terrible idea. This isn't a story. But sometimes if I put myself into, like, oh, this is interesting. So, like, the Phillips curve is not really panning out. What's going on? Like, let's look at the Phillips curve. So I think that's my own way of coping with that. I mean, it just happens. I think it happens with, like, every story. It's never clean. It's never like, this is what I think the story is. And yes, it is. And here's the perfect example. And the perfect person I talked to illustrates this perfectly. I mean, I guess it would be a boring job if that happened, but yeah, life so rarely conforms. so rarely conforms to what we expect. But yeah, no, it happens all the time, every day, constantly.
I'm confident that the educators here can sympathize with that. You go in with your lesson and everything's going to work this way, and it never works out exactly as we expect. But you're right. That's the fun part, right? Is navigating that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. Please join me in thanking Stacey for carving time out of her day to talk to us. I think there's a lot of overlap between the kind of work that we're doing, and I think these tricks for bringing our audience in are something that we can apply to the classroom as well. So thank you again. It's been our pleasure having you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for the work that you do. It's very important.